and welcome to Survey Magazine's webinar series. The title of today's webinar is Becoming Data-Driven, Planning for Success. Today's event is sponsored by Teradata. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's session. Please find the GoToWebinar control panel on the right side of your screen. There are a number of features that may improve your viewing experience today. You may hide or show your control panel by clicking the orange arrow, or you may toggle between full screen and a minimized screen by clicking the computer screen icon on the left side of the control panel. Here, you will also find the ability to enter a question by typing in the questions box and clicking send. Throughout the presentation, we encourage you to interact with our speakers. We will be collecting your questions and comments during the presentation and conducting a question and answer period after today's presentation. If you'd like to join the conversation on Twitter, the hashtag is #SurveyWebinar. The Twitter handle for today's guest is @Teradata. We'd love to have you connect with us and keep the conversation going beyond today's event. We are also recording today's session and will make the link to the recording available 48 hours after today's presentation via email. For more information on the event, you can visit surveymagazine.org. Click on the gray button in the center of the page titled Research Webinars. Once on the webinars page, scroll down to find today's Teradata event and click Register. More information about this webinar can be found by clicking on the Accordions tab, or learn more about today's speakers by clicking on their image to go to their profile page. You can also download today's presentation by clicking the download button on the right side of the page. Now, onto today's event. In an era where the term big data is heard everywhere, and many organizations are still struggling to ensure they have the right strategy in place, a few have managed to transform their business by simply making data analytics a strategic asset. As a result, these organizations have gained better customer insight, increased operational efficiency, improved financial management, and created new products and services. Not only are they leveraging data and analytics across their organization, but they are taking action on this data, even when it's not perfect. Tom Davenport, Professor of Management and IT at Babson College, and Bill Franks, Chief Analytics Officer of Teradata, are here today to discuss and provide many real-world examples of organizations that have attained data-driven status. Tom Davenport is also the co-founder of the International Institute for Analytics and a fellow of the MIT Center for Digital Business. He teaches analytics and big data in executive programs at Babson, Harvard Business School, MIT Sloan School, and Boston University. Bill Franks is a longtime analytics professional who provides insights on trends in the analytics and big data space and helps companies understand how Teradata and its analytics partners can support their needs. Now, I'd like to be the first to welcome your moderator, John Lehman, editor and publisher for Survey Magazine, to today's event and turn the program over to him now. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paula. I'd like to welcome everybody that's here in attendance today, and also I'd like to extend a thank you to both Bill and Tom for taking their time out to be with us today. I think it's going to be a great event, and I know that you'll get a lot of enjoyment out of their thought leadership. So I'd like to start things off this afternoon by framing the conversation a little bit. I'm assuming that being data-driven can mean a lot of different things. Perhaps data-driven decision-making, data-driven companies, strategy, marketing, etc. Tom, perhaps you could start things off for us. What does it mean to be data-driven?
So there are a lot of ways that we can think about being data-driven. We did a quick Google search to see what comes up when you search for the term data-driven, and there are a lot of possibilities here. We're really talking today about data-driven organizations, the idea of applying a data-driven philosophy, if you will, to an entire company or nonprofit or governmental organization. But we can think about it at the individual level in terms of, data-driven executives. We can think about it in terms of aspects of organizations. Data-driven decision-making is a common variation on this term, and I think an important thing if you're going to get the value out of the data and the analytics that you are using. You can talk about data-driven marketing or data-driven supply chains, data-driven product design. You can even get down to a very detailed level. I wasn't actually sure what this is. Maybe you know, Bill, but the idea of data-driven programming is something that's pretty popular. So there are a lot of different usages of this term, and we're going to try to shed some light on how a particular organization can become much more data-driven and get some benefits and some competitive advantage out of that transformation.
Yeah, and I guess, Tom, when I think about it, I think the key theme here is across all these different areas, the common thread is that term data-driven. And what I take away from that is obviously data itself in its raw form isn't going to drive typically much of anything. What it really requires, of course, is the use of that data, the analysis of that data, et cetera. And I think that that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So if you want to maybe go to the next slide. What does it mean to be data-driven? And I think it really, none of this is going to be a surprise to most people, but I think it is absolutely worth reviewing. It means that you really are making your decisions based on data and analytics. It's not that there won't be occasions where intuition or gut has to come into play, but it means that really, when it comes time for a decision, people both expect and embrace the idea of data and analysis being a component of that. A piece of that, of course, is if I'm going to make a decision based on data, I should also measure the impact of that decision based on data. And so you sort of get a virtuous cycle here. As I've made a decision and implemented a change, data should be getting created that helps me assess whether that was a correct decision or not, which in turn enables me to make the next decision. Obviously, you're going to have to get data consistent. None of this is possible if you have inconsistent data, really dirty data, huge chunks of missing data. You can't drive the business with it unless you have it. And once you have it, again, you have to use it well. I think one of the key things to keep in mind as you think about this, it's not really a binary definition that you are or aren't data-driven. You're going to go on a journey to get there. And in fact, there are companies who might be very data-driven in one area like supply chain and have very limited skills yet in an area like customer. And that's okay. The idea is that you should always be pushing your organization to, continue where you're strong, but then in time grow up the areas where you're weak.
But I think our general argument, Bill, would be that the more areas in which you can be data-driven, the better, right?
Absolutely, correct.
So a lot of you may be thinking, this sounds like a great idea, but our data within my organization really isn't very good. We have a number of data quality problems, or we have 14 definitions of what constitutes a customer, or we can't get any consensus on how many employees we have because, various different sources come up with different numbers. And I think it's important to realize that these are very common problems. If it's sufficiently bad, then it may mean that you have to do a lot of work to clean and integrate your data before you can be data-driven. But the fact is, Bill and I see lots of different organizations. We have yet to find one that has perfect data by any means. But if you have some degree of data governance, some degree of data quality, some degree of data integration, chances are pretty good that you'll be okay.
Oh, great. Thanks, guys. I know that you're both fresh off of authoring a new white paper on the topic. And as I read through it, I see that you've outlined essentially 4 primary advantages of being a data-driven organization. I'd like to know, Tom, can you share some of these benefits? How did you arrive at these 4 primary advantages, and perhaps share some examples of how some organizations have, truly realized the benefit of being data-driven?
Absolutely, John. So one key benefit, which won't surprise anybody, is you have better relationships with your customers when you have better customer insights and better awareness of the kind of business that your customer is doing with you and better awareness of the customer's needs. So the truly data-driven organization from a customer standpoint basically is pretty obsessive about it and gathers and analyzes data from almost all, if not all, customer transactions and interactions. Historically, we were quite focused on gathering basic demographic information about our customers. You know, who is the customer, who's the individual we're transacting with, how large is the company, et cetera. If we're talking about consumers, you know, where do they live and what's their family status and so on. What we increasingly want to know now is not just these fundamental attributes of a customer, but what kind of business have they done with us? That sounds like a pretty straightforward question that you'd be able to get from your ERP system or other kind of transaction system, but particularly for multi-channel organizations, for highly divisionalized organizations, it can be very difficult to understand how much business a customer does with you. So I think that's a kind of a fundamental requirement. I remember working with a company a number of years ago that new CEO came in and he was very anxious to get out a letter to the top 100 customers saying how happy he was to be there and how willing he was to serve them and so on. And it took 6 months to come up with a list of top 100 customers. You don't want to be an organization like that. You want to have a pretty good sense of what your customers have bought from you and which customers have bought the most. And then now, increasingly, it's not just what you buy, it's what you express interest in by the pages that you view and the clicks that you make online. That's the great thing about online marketing. We always had a little bit of a hard time knowing whether a customer opened a direct mail envelope or not, but we effectively know whether you've opened that online envelope by whether you click on it, how long you stay on that page, how many unique visits you have, and so on. So these are just some of the attributes. I don't know, maybe Bill, you want to describe some more. There's a very long list.
Yeah, I think the key is the list, some of the things you mentioned, it's the fact that that list is growing, right? There's always seems to be new sources of customer data available these days. And I know in the research that we've done and project work with various companies, you know, we find that new components of data are adding a lot of value. So people are, you know, you see the little network graph here on this slide, even, you know, being much more broadly used maybe than it used to be, the relationships between individuals. It's just an ever-growing breadth of data, and that can only help your analytics.
So we want to just give a couple of examples. Many of you may have heard about Caesars, formerly known as Harrah's, and their focus on customer loyalty and a customer database program for loyal customers called Total Rewards. Caesars has been fantastically successful with this program over the years. Arguably, it made them the world's largest gaming firm, which they are today. Now, through nothing related to customer interactions, Caesars has had a few issues in terms of accumulating a little bit too much debt in a private equity transaction, but the Total Rewards program is going strong. My sense is Caesars probably knows more about its customers than any organization I've ever dealt with. They offer a huge amount of value in exchange for all of that information they possess. Gary Loveman, who just became chairman, told me that no single person has ever complained about being in the Caesars Total Rewards database just because of all the, you know, the benefits and perks that you get as a result of it. In some of these financial discussions about Caesars ownership and so on, the loyalty database was recently valued at over $1 billion. So, you know, we don't have a lot of information systems in this world that by themselves are valued at over $1 billion. So that's quite astounding. The other prominent example of this is an organization I've worked with recently RBC, or if you're not Canadian, Royal Bank of Canada. RBC has a very large presence in Canada. They have about 1 in every 4 Canadians as customers, and they have always been quite oriented to customer data. They established the first customer data warehouse in Canada. They were the first bank in Canada to set up an institutional customer data warehouse and a consumer data warehouse, but they certainly didn't stop there. They have all sorts of customer analytics. They did a lot of work on activity-based costing to understand, what it costs to serve a customer through different channels. They try to gently direct a customer to the channel that they think is best suited to them, and even using this particular graphic that we have on this page, they started to do some network analysis to understand, I may have relatively low lifetime value. They were among the first to do lifetime value calculations for their customers. But my Aunt Minnie in Saskatchewan has a very high lifetime value with a bank, and just as a result of my relationship with her, I can get a better rate on a loan. So not a whole lot better. It's not free by any means, but I'm starting to realize that customers are not just individuals; they are parts of social networks, and we need to begin treating them that way. So those are a couple of examples of organizations that are really good at this. I don't know if you want to add anything or not, Bill.
Yeah, I think two things that really are tying together the successful stories is, first of all, the organizations that have been really successful with customer data, they don't view customer data simply as something that they can harvest for their own value and for their own purposes. In other words, it's not about Harrah's or RBC or Caesars, anyone else, just using that customer data internally to try and improve their business. They literally are trying to use it to meet customer needs and keep the customer happy. And of course, if you do the latter, keeping the customer happy, meeting their needs, they're going to tend to stick with you more. The other key aspect with a lot of this data is the privacy issue, and we could do an entire webinar just on the privacy points. I think one key thing to keep in mind, it's all about an exchange of value. If you want customers to give you detailed data and to allow you to use it, then you absolutely have to make sure that you're giving something back to them in return. And the example from Caesars, of course, there's very tangible benefits that the members get, and therefore they're willing to allow all sorts of information to be tracked. So I think you just have to keep that perspective that, sure, you're doing it for your business to improve it, but you always also have to be thinking about what's it going to do to improve your customers, particularly with a lot of the sensitive data we have today.
I think that's a very good point, and I remember talking with Tesco about this. Terry Leahy, who's the former CEO who established their loyalty program, said, we are absolutely dedicated to providing rewards and value to our best customers, and that is the primary purpose of their loyalty database, not just something that they could exploit to market more. Okay, let's go to the next slide for another benefit.
Yeah, and this one is an interesting one. Operational efficiency. This is becoming obviously a huge focus, and really technology is enabling this. When you think about supply chains today, how complex they are. They're truly global, multiple different organizations involved, things shipping all around the world. Boats, trucks, trains, everything's involved. And then manufacturing. Manufacturing plants today, they're incredibly sophisticated. In fact, some of the most innovative analytics I'm seeing are in some of what are considered very stodgy old school manufacturing organizations, because they're suddenly having the ability to have sensors throughout their assembly lines and really track this information. So from an operational perspective, I think just as with customer, there's a lot of exciting things happening. There's absolutely things operationally. I know, Tom, you love the service and sales process aspects. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the reason I like them, Bill, is just because they were relatively neglected for such a long time from an operational perspective. And now, we have one of the reasons why Caesars was so successful is they took a very aggressive approach to measuring, using data in their service processes, even to the point of understanding that exactly what drives a good customer experience. It turns out smiles, how often people smile at you, are the #2 factor in whether you have a successful visit to one of their resorts or not. Now you say, well, okay, what's #1? As you may have guessed, it's whether you win or not, and they decided not to maximize that in the customer's favor. But just applying those disciplines of TQM and Six Sigma and measurement and data use as much as you can to service processes, I think is something that the best retailers and healthcare organizations and other service companies are doing these days.
Yeah, and there's some really good examples. So a lot of people probably haven't heard of McCain Foods, but I guarantee you've eaten what they produce. They actually produce 1 of 3 French fries globally. So if you're eating French fries,
I eat 1 of 3 French fries globally. What a coincidence!
There it is. You must be their best customer. So yeah, what they did, back to my point about manufacturing facilities, they've started to track the efficiency of their manufacturing processes, and they get 15-minute updates to information on what's happening, and they've developed metrics such as an operational equipment efficiency score that'll sort of give you a view into how efficient do we think things are running right now compared to what they might do. And what this has done is it not only allows them to have their people focus on the right things, because now those people understand what goes into those metrics, but it starts some healthy competition. Various plants now, enjoy competing to try and have the top score for the week, to be the most efficient out of the various plants. And of course, that's only good for the company in terms of getting people to compete to do a better job, and then also helps with the consistency of the product that's going to be created. And then in that scenario, as is common, all the way up to the CEO will actually look at this information, look for patterns that are found to be either troubling or encouraging, and ask executives then to go drill down. So it's really helped them transform, and part of that required them going from what they termed 30,000 versions of the truth, where they had data spread out all over the place, to getting into a single unified system that allowed them to track what was needed. Another recent example has been NCR, and actually Teradata used to be a part of NCR until not quite a decade ago, but we still work with them closely, and you come in contact with their equipment on a daily basis, whether you use ATMs or point of sales or airport kiosks, and they've started to analyze the data from those machine sensors that are embedded within them to identify and predict when things might go wrong. So if they have a technician in an area and it looks like one of the rollers in an ATM is a little bit wobbly or a little bit having to rotate a little harder than it should, they'll go proactively fix that. And their ultimate goal is to have no unplanned downtime of any equipment anywhere. I think obviously in a real world that goal will never actually be 100% achievable, but they've made substantial progress towards that, which of course means their customers, the direct customers like the bank or the retailer who has their equipment, is happier, and then those of us, when we go to a point of sale system or an ATM, they work and we're happy. And then one last one I'll just mention. I think it's phenomenal to watch some of the new companies like an Uber or Airbnb. These companies have no inventory, no facilities of their own. Their entire value prop is on providing some type of operational efficiency to people. So, Uber's telling drivers where the good pickup spots are based on historical patterns. They can estimate to you pretty precisely how long it'll take the driver to get to you. And they also have the surge pricing concept, which helps mean a ride is available if you absolutely need one, versus I know on a rainy 5 o'clock in the afternoon New York City day, if I'm trying to get a cab, it's almost impossible. And Airbnb, for example, just tracking the data of how people actually closed business on their site, realized that having professional photographs of a high quality really helped the sale. So they put in place a whole program to help connect the property owners with professional photographers to get those photos on the site to make them more likely to rent. Of course, when that happens, Airbnb gets a cut. So a lot of exciting stuff. I know, Tom, you've spent some time in the healthcare space, and there's some great things there too. What do you want to inform us about that.
Well, yeah, I want to talk briefly about Cleveland Clinic, but I wanted to ask you, Bill, Uber was just valued this week in another financing deal at about $50 billion, and I want to ask you, what percentage of that value comes from being data-driven?
That's a great question. I'll be honest with you. If you think about it, I'd say the vast majority, because most all of what Uber's doing is based on data, right? It's who you are, where you want to go, where the drivers are, how quickly they can get there, computing a price that's acceptable to both. I mean, really, if you think about it, I don't know that there's hardly any part of their business that isn't based on data, and therefore I'd argue that the vast majority of it is for being data-driven, and maybe there's a component just for having a novel business model generically. But again, that business model, the novelness of it is novelty of it is that data-driven aspect, in my opinion.
Yeah, without the data-driven part, it's a glorified taxi company with no taxis, right?
Exactly.
Cleveland Clinic is just one example. I think one of the leading examples of healthcare providers in general and of data-driven healthcare providers. There aren't quite as many in that industry, but a couple of different generations of CEOs at Cleveland Clinic have been quite focused on becoming more data-driven to try to address particular operational problems like customers or patients having long waits. Now they pride themselves on 70% of patients could get an appointment within 24 hours if they wanted to. Cleveland Clinic was the biggest blood user in the United States. I've suggested that perhaps they had some vampires lurking in some of the rooms there, but no, they just do a lot of operations, they told me, and so they started to focus the light of data on blood use and to change some processes related to blood use, and they've been quite successful at reducing that amount. So I think no matter what the industry, you can make some substantial improvements in your operations this way. Let's talk a little bit about perhaps the most traditional benefit of being data-driven is being better in managing your finances. And there are a whole number of areas that you could address from this perspective. Certainly, if you're a bank, being data-driven is all about risk and management of risk and reduction of risk whenever possible. Any company these days that spends its capital can do testing to see whether this particular investment works better than that one. My favorite example in that area is a supermarket chain in the Southeast trying to decide, do lobster tanks actually sell more lobsters? Should we spend the money to put a lobster tank in every supermarket? And I said, well, do they? And initially they said, well, sorry, we can't tell you. But I did find out, it turns out, yes, but only if it's a neighborhood where people can afford lobsters in the first place, in case you wanted to know that. Performance management has always been a kind of a backward-looking discipline, but the most sophisticated companies now are starting to say, we can predict once we understand the drivers of our financial performance, and many companies have been doing scorecards, balanced scorecards for a long time, you can take that data and start to run a statistical model and understand if customer service levels are going down, what's going to be the impact on profits? If employee satisfaction is a factor in our success, what happens when that drops by a few points in the annual survey or whatever? So we can start to get much more predictive about this, and the most sophisticated companies are doing that now.
Yeah,
Bill, you want to give some examples of this phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, one, it just comes down to vaccine data and the availability of data, right? So, the one example that we've talked about a number of times is Boeing getting all their financial data, not just available, not just clean, but available broadly in a consistent fashion to enable people to make decisions based on the most current finance status. So I think it comes down, that sounds very basic and very elementary, and it is in terms of a concept, but the execution to actually get there is as many on the audience probably are aware, isn't near as easy as it sounds to actually implement. So it does take some some concerted effort. I know, you know, Tom, you've got a number of other examples here. I remember you mentioning to me that I think would be great to hear.
Well, yeah, we don't have a lot of time to go into detail on them, but TD Bank, a large Canadian bank like RBC, very focused on that kind of predictive performance management that I mentioned earlier, was able to establish that 19% of the variation in branch profitability was related to variations in the kind of service those branches provided. So that's a pretty useful thing to know if you're thinking about investments in improving service. In insurance, particularly property and casualty insurance these days, so-called usage-based insurance, pay-as-you-drive, it's sometimes called, is all the rage. A whole variety of companies now are doing this. I think Progressive was one of the earliest in this country, but you've also got Allstate with a version and State Farm and various other companies. This is basically bringing the data-driven idea to insurance, where insurers will charge you on the basis of how much you drive, how fast you drive, how fast you accelerate and decelerate, what time of day do you drive. And you know, some people think it's rather invasive to have an insurance company monitoring what they do all the time, but the people who know that they're safe drivers and who have tried this out know that you can get some quite substantial discounts this way, and they're more than happy to have their insurance company so-called spy on them if they can get substantially lower prices as a result. So I think we'll probably be seeing that more and more. John Hancock just announced usage-based insurance for health insurance, where if you wear an activity tracker and have a high level of activity, you can get lower health insurance prices. So I think we'll see more and more of this kind of thing. Let's talk about what I think is in some ways the most exciting form of benefit from this whole area, which is new products and services. Bill, you want to talk about that some?
Yeah, the interesting thing here, most people think about data-driven products and services being primarily the purview of that first sub-bullet around online companies. And certainly, as we've already talked about a little bit ago with the Uber and Airbnb examples, that's true. Though the online companies, many of them did in fact start and have in their DNA from the get-go being data-driven. However, it's really not limited to those kind of companies anymore. There are absolutely a lot of traditional companies now beginning to develop data products. I know of at least one major telco that has a VP level spot that's aimed simply at coming up with new data products that aren't tied to their core business line. In other words, how can they package, aggregate, and resell information from what they've collected to third parties? And you know, in that case, that's a new business unit targeted with that. In other cases, there might be some one-off products, but absolutely, you know, data-driven products and services is growing a lot.
Yeah, so I've done some work with Monsanto in this space. They and now several of their competitors as well are offering precision agriculture services that tell farmers, you know, when to plant, how much to plant, where to plant, how much to fertilize, how much water to put on, and you know, when to put on the pesticides, and how likely is drought in your part of the country, even down to the field level. And then, you know, what day should I harvest on? And, you know, they charge for that advice, and farmers are increasingly willing to pay for it if you get, you know, an additional 10% yield or something like that. There are new business companies, as you mentioned, online companies like LinkedIn, who have these products like People You May Know. I think that was the first data product at LinkedIn. They attribute half of their members to people you may know. I know I hope nobody's looking at it during our little webinar here, but I know on long conference calls I find it very handy to, you know, while away the the minutes. Then even traditional banks, JP Morgan Chase and Barclays, have formed new business units to try to say, how do we take the value of our all the vast amount of data that we have on our customers and provide some of it back to customers in terms of new product and service offerings, not just monetizing it, but providing increased value to our customers.
And I'll just thought one slight variation on that is some of the things that companies like GE are doing, wherein they're embedding sensors and then analytics against that data within their products that make the original product even better and more stable. So whether you're in an aircraft engine or a wind turbine, there's a fundamental part of that product now is the collection and analysis of data on an ongoing way to both inform the end owner of that equipment as to the status and what might need to be done, as well as the manufacturer. And if anyone hasn't looked at the interesting things happening in the automotive industry in this area recently, they ought to go walk around a few new car lots and ask the salespeople about the data that's being generated from the cars today, and I think you'll be surprised.
I think John's going to take us into a new section here.
Yes, thank you very much, gentlemen. Tom, changing cultures and structure and other dynamics that are in play in most organizations, is typically not a very easy task, for most leadership. Is it a paradigm shift for organization? Is there a process that you could recommend, or perhaps some key choices that a company can make to become more data-driven?
Sure. Surprisingly, we have a slide on that coming up next. What are some of the key choices that organizations have to face in this regard? And not everyone is going to go in the same direction on these at all. For example, Bill was just talking about GE, which has primarily, I think, obviously they have some internal uses of data as well, but their focus over the last few years has been very focused on what new products and services can we provide to customers in this area of the industrial internet and of sensor-driven maintenance and so on. On the other hand, you might have a company like Procter & Gamble. I wrote a case study on them a couple of years ago. They're in consumer products. It's unlikely they're going to be selling data anytime soon, and really strong focus of theirs has been on how do we make better internal decisions about the products and markets that we compete in, and which ones are doing well and which ones aren't, and why. Just a really aggressive approach to that issue. So you have to decide, am I primarily interested in internal decisions, or do I want to improve things directly for my customers? Then there's the question of, am I primarily focused on providing new sources of value through customer relationships and marketing and so on, or the offense side of business, if you will, to use a sports analogy, or is it really a matter of preventing touchdowns by my competitors, or preventing security breaches, or some of the more defense-oriented activities? So obviously, in banking these days, it's a regulatory intensive environment, very strong focus on defense for a lot of those organizations, risk and security and privacy and so on. Traditionally, I think the focus has been on how do we make more money and provide more value to customers with data and analytics. And so you need to decide, am I primarily focused on offense or defense in that regard?
Yeah, another thing, I'll just comment on that infrastructure or business application. What this means really is it's a matter of a bit of chicken or the egg. Without an infrastructure to support the data-driven activities that you need, obviously you can have the best ideas in the world and it's not going to work. At the same time, you could have the world's best infrastructure, and if you haven't built any applications and actual analytics on top of that infrastructure to make something happen, you're not going to actually get any value. So one of the key decisions companies have to make is, where are they on the maturity curve on both those areas, and then how do they have to balance their budgeting? So sometimes it can go to the extreme. In the financial space, Lloyd's a few years ago felt they were so far behind on an infrastructure perspective that they made the determination, we're going to take a year or two and invest virtually all of our upcoming funding to overhaul and completely redo our infrastructure to prepare it for the next generation of applications. And the management team bought into that as a whole, and they went through a process, and everyone understood for there's going to be a period of time there wouldn't be a whole lot of new exciting applications, but they were laying that important groundwork. Similarly, At this point, I'm sure after they've completed that, they probably put the vast majority of their funding for a year or two in the applications. But that's one important area. And then one other thing I'll point out is this idea that we've already hinted on about moving beyond your classic data that's either a transaction, a financial entry of some type, and your classic data, and really looking at the more detailed data on that you can gather on your business, whether it be from sensors, from web logs, from social media, et cetera. There's a broader availability of data, and you're really going to have to consider how to best leverage all of that.
Yeah, don't notice that we no longer talk about small data or big data. I think these are much more descriptive-oriented terms. And speaking of descriptive, one choice from the analytics you do is we do the traditional business intelligence-oriented, backward-looking descriptive analytics, maybe with a strong visual orientation, or would your business benefit more from predictive and prescriptive analytics? And more organizations are choosing to enhance the predictive and prescriptive capabilities, but as you adopt some new sources of data like social media, for example, you may be perfectly happy with descriptive when you just get into it. And then increasingly, big focus of mine these days is who's going to make the decisions? Are we preparing all of this data and analysis for a human to make the decision, or can we just embed it into a system? And Bill, I know your new book is about operational analytics. Many of those decisions end up, being made invisibly and in an automated fashion, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's what I've called the analytics revolution. It's sort of like the industrial revolution of analytics, where we have these automated, embedded analytics just running and making these decisions on an ongoing basis, and there's a whole lot of implications of that. But to be data-driven, it's almost a necessity to do that, because you can't make the number and complexity of decisions we're talking about for a business if people have to get in the middle of each and every one every day.
Thank you again. Bill, this question, it may be more directed towards you and directly with Teradata. Again, as I read through your white paper, there seemed to be almost a hierarchy of or level of achievement for becoming more data-driven. Can you share what some of these steps or various levels are, and how did you arrive at them? Are these goals that an organization should set, or are they just kind of more of a natural progression, as they work through maturing, as becoming more data-driven?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So you can see here that we sort of broke it down into three stages, right? The first one, and we'll talk about each of these in turn here. But you got to start with a foundation. You got to get some basics in place. Then you can start to build some fundamental data-driven competencies, as we term it, getting some of the next level of sophistication on top, and from there you can move into what we call the data-driven strategy and competition. And the key is this is a progression. You're going to have to evolve through it, and you can't skip stages. In other words, you cannot achieve data-driven strategy and competition without the two prior steps being done, because it really is building upon one another.
So I just wanted to mention that you don't want to do these activities for their own sake. You want to have some clarity about what you're trying to accomplish. How is it going to lead to competitive advantage for your organization? We had a number of organizations in the ERP days who just said, I need to put in ERP. Never really thought about what was going to be distinctive about it, how they were going to differ from every other organization that had ERP in their industry. So I think some careful thought by the management team on why are we doing this, and what particular type of benefits are we going to get from being data-driven, and how's it going to lead to competitive advantage is a really, really important issue. The foundation stage, of course, is the one that you need to focus on at the beginning. Not terribly exciting. Many large, sophisticated companies have passed this stage at this point, but it's just, having some good transaction systems like ERP and CRM that are providing that basic data, hopefully not too many different, versions of them within an organization. A place to store the data for analysis. We typically think of a data warehouse or data mart in that context, which, obviously Teradata is one of the leading suppliers of. Descriptive analytics are kind of the baseline there, with reports and scorecards and dashboards and maybe some queries and even some alerts. And then finally, some sort of governance structure. Who's responsible for making sure that key data is of sufficient quality and that we've got it integrated across the organization and so on. So a little basic, but unless you have those basics in place, you're not going to do well at those higher stages.
Yeah, and I think, Tom, I remember a phrase from my college math that when we were doing proofs, which was necessary but not sufficient. I think that's the key takeaway I have for this stage. You're not data-driven if you get this in place, but you cannot be data-driven without it. So it's, as you say, not necessarily the most exciting area today, but absolutely necessary.
Well, so let's talk about what comes beyond it.
Yes, yeah. So I think when you get into data-driven competencies, this is where really a lot of the larger, more successful companies are beginning to move aggressively towards, if not already be fully here. Obviously, that widespread use of the predictive and prescriptive analytics, really having data drive things. Obviously, you're going to need to have both the right skill sets and the right tools and technologies to make all of that work. In some cases, frontline workers, as example, are probably just given the output of an analysis. For example, a call center agent's going to be told, offer this to this customer. They're not aware of or thinking about the analytics versus, someone like me behind the scenes might be very much aware of how those analytics are put in place. This idea of changing the culture to an evidence-based culture is just really simple. When I come and tell you I think we should do A, B, or C, I ought to be able to back that up with some data, period. If all I can say is it's my gut feeling, that shouldn't be good enough. I think in our customer base at Teradata, of course, this third point is huge. Virtually all of the big companies today are moving into these novel, newer data sources, whether it's clickstream, social media, a whole lot of activity with text. When you think of text, it could be customer service interactions via phone, chat, email. There's a whole variety of ways. And most important, I think, at the end, as with a lot of big initiatives, this is when executives at a high level really get on board and begin to push it. Because the bottom line, if the executives aren't demanding it and then requiring it of their people, those people in turn probably won't follow through.
Right, and I think this stage used to be quite differentiating, and it used to be, I think the world's most sophisticated companies were at this stage, but now this is almost becoming table stakes in the large sophisticated organizations. If you're not doing at least this, you really can't keep up. And then, of course, there's the most sophisticated stage of all, which we call data-driven strategy and competition. This is, I've done a lot of work in analytics. These are the companies that were analytical competitors. Increasingly, they're the organizations that are producing data products that we were describing earlier, very focused on operationalizing analytics and creating some automated decisions in areas where you have to have very high speed and high quality. These are the organizations that are working with technologies like Hadoop and data discovery platforms and data lakes and so on. I think we are really on the verge of an entirely new set of possibilities in this space. The old ones aren't going away, but they need to be augmented and integrated with some of these new technologies and a new set of roles. Bill, you and I have just collaborated on an International Institute for Analytics project on chief data officers and chief analytics officers, and these are, I think, very important roles. I don't suppose you think, Bill, that chief analytics officer is an important role, do you?
Well, of course, I don't have any bias on that question whatsoever, but so I'm free to say yes, absolutely. But in all seriousness, I think both these roles are important. As you mentioned, we just finished that paper for International Institute for Analytics. We've got an hour webinar on just this topic tomorrow. But to me, the key takeaway is this: if analytics and the data which feed it is going to be a strategic component of your company, then what I always challenge the executives I talk to about is, well, if you don't have an owner of that at an executive level, setting the strategy and creating the vision and driving the results, how's it ever going to happen? And to me, the rise of chief data and chief analytics officers really stems from the recognition that if you're going to be data-driven and really have all of the aspects that we've gone through in this webinar in place in your company, well, you've got to have some people that take the ownership of the core parts of that. And that's really, to me, what these represent.
So you may be wondering, so who the heck are these companies that are at this ultimate stage of being data-driven? And, it won't surprise you, many of them are in data-intensive industries like financial services and online and retail. Bill, you want to talk about some of these financial services firms?
Yeah, I think the key here is one thing I found over the years, and we already hinted at this earlier, is that a lot of companies can be phenomenal in one area and not another. So when you get in the financial sector, they've been ahead on analytics for quite some time. They've been doing things in the area of risk, credit scoring, fraud for many years. But when you start to think about that, plus customer, plus financial forecasting and so forth, there's a lot of different areas. And so even amongst the list that you see here among the financial services firms, back to my point I made at the beginning, not all of them are experts at all of the various aspects, but each of them has mastered at least one or two functional areas and is growing a strong competency in the others and evolving. I'd say the same thing really in retail. There are some of the retailers who are phenomenal when it comes to the supply chain and the operational aspects of running a retail business. Others are incredible when it comes to customer interactions and understanding their customers and always ensuring an appropriate interaction and experience. And again, there's starting to be cross-pollination. 10 years ago, I would work with a given company in either of these industries or others, and they may be focused on just one aspect in terms of driving analytics into it. And now, it's much more pervasive that organizations are moving beyond wherever they started and spreading it out more broadly.
And I would say the same thing for these online companies. All of them obviously very focused on data products and the use of data for customer interaction. Some, LinkedIn is a pretty good example, focused also on how do we make our sales force more productive with data and analytics, how do we make better internal decisions. So I know we want to get to the questions. I think these will give you some idea of the kind of organizations that we're talking about, and not surprisingly, they're all pretty successful organizations. We have certainly found a correlation, at least, probably a causal relationship too, between being more data-driven and being more successful financially. So with that, I'll turn things back to you, John, see if we have any questions to address.
Yeah, thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been really informative this afternoon, and want to thank you for your time. We do have a number of questions that we'd like to pose, and I'd also like to mention to our audience that if you do have questions, go ahead and type them into our questions box on the right-hand side of the panel, and we'll field as many of these as we can. So the first question is, what is the best way to go about building a business case and preparing culturally, for an organization to become more data-driven?
I'm sure Bill will have some comments on that. This is Tom, and I think I'd say that you may not want to bite off the business case all at once for going to the competitive data-driven status. You may want to say, okay, in our industry, we're going to succeed through, customer loyalty, and we need to be really good at that first, and so we're going to make an investment in a loyalty database and a set of analytics capabilities to analyze that data. I think building the business case piece by piece is probably a better route to success than saying, I need a big pile of money to go data-driven all at once.
Yeah, and Tom, I'd agree with that. I always espouse starting small because, pragmatically speaking, as we already mentioned, you sort of have to layer these things on top of one another. And so to find some areas that you think you can go out and get some success, prove that the concepts work, and then expand is, especially in today's financial environment, I think is just a more plausible way to achieve what you want.
Okay, great. Let's. Here's another question that we covered a little bit, but perhaps you both can elaborate a little more. So, which groups do you consider key stakeholders when moving in an organization in this direction, and how would you go about getting started or get some early traction?
Well, it's funny. Bill and I were talking about this recently about how important is it that IT leads this transformation, the IT organization. And I think my argument was that you have all these new roles like chief analytics officer and chief data officer, and I thought ideally if the IT organization is very capable, they would all kind of report into the same place. You'd have everybody aligned and clear role definition and so on. I do think that's the case, but I don't know, Bill, you reminded me that it doesn't always work.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that you've got to have sort of there's a broad set of stakeholders, and people have to be willing to have some give and take, right? So what I, as the business person, think is the top priority and I want to do may make very good sense, but I may have to temper a little bit of that with what's realistic to achieve, today, given the realities of the budget and the data and the systems, et cetera. And similarly, you're going to need if you're on the support side of this from IT enabling these things, you're going to have to also, challenge yourself around whether some of the changing business requirements necessitate changing some of what's happening. So I think, I know, Tom, we've talked about this. I always say that, honestly, the technical aspects of success here in many ways are easy compared to some of the cultural and political aspects and the various concessions and agreements and compromises that have to be made to actually put those tools and technologies to use.
Okay, thank you. Here's our third question. How would you go about handling sensitive data, or how to ensure certain data is secured?
Put it in a Teradata warehouse. Is that the answer, Bill? Or
That's certainly an answer. I think generically speaking, the key is you've got to be very cautious about handling your sensitive data today. I mean, it's pretty scary. I mean, if you just look around the last couple of weeks, there's been several major data breaches across multiple industries: government, healthcare, financial, retail. It's really a big issue. I think it's one of the underbelly, the bad parts of this. As you collect more data and drive business on it, nefarious actors may attempt to get into that where they shouldn't be allowed. So I think you absolutely have to have as a part of your strategy, a pretty thoughtful approach to securing and protecting that data.
Yeah, the only thing I would certainly agree, but we had on our list of highly aggressive organizations in this data-driven space a couple who have been who had some prominent breaches, have been hacked or whatever. And I think it's important to realize these days basically that happens to everybody. And you can't, while you need to take all sorts of precautions to prevent really sensitive data from getting out to the world, you can't let that keep you from addressing the data-driven strategies that are going to make you successful as an organization. It's kind of that offense versus defense balance. And yes, everybody needs a lot of defense these days, but Charles Thomas, the chief data and analytics officer at Wells Fargo, is fond of saying, we've got to spend equal time on both. And I think it's best when an organization can create that kind of balance.
Okay, fantastic. So this is a good question because we hear a lot about big data and some of these other terms that have been thrown around. And so this listener is asking, how do you get around what I categorize as Hadoop hype, the desire of organizations to progress directly to big data without having, the basic structures in place to manage and exploit data, where information seems to be overriding common sense?
Has there been hype around Hadoop? I haven't. No, I'm just kidding. um, yeah, I think it's a very good question, and the good news on that issue is I think things are getting a little bit better, and the Hadoop hype and the big data hype is receding a little bit. People are more focused on data in general, but the question is right on in that you are not going to be successful in dealing with big data unless you have some, small data management capabilities. If you can't manage the data from your ERP system successfully, then it's not going to get any better if you decide, oh, I'm going to start managing customer clickstream data and behavioral data of various types and genomic data in healthcare and all that sort of thing. It's just much more complex and difficult, and if you can't handle the basics, you're not going to succeed.
Super. So here's an interesting question actually out of the manufacturing industries. So listener is saying, we're collecting a lot of manufacturing process data. Do you know how we go about embedding Minitab or JPEG data analysis software to obtain real-time reporting?
Well,
Bill, you want
that might be a better follow-up question for later. I mean, there's a lot of technical aspects to that. Certainly, there are a lot of manufacturing companies doing a whole lot of analysis, particularly when I think of real time in this case. Maybe it's streaming data out of a bunch of sensors. There's a variety of ways to go about that that probably we don't have time to really do justice to here.
Certainly. So we'll make sure that we get a detailed response then out to this listener. And so we have time for one more question, and this one is more towards pharmaceutical space. So how does the pharmaceutical industry, how can it be benefited from data-driven approach? And I think we elaborated a little bit on that, but maybe you can expand a little bit.
Well, I'll say something about it. Historically, pharmaceutical data comes in several different categories. There's commercial data, who's prescribing your drugs to whom, who's selling effectively, and so on. There's R&D oriented data. How's that particular clinical trial coming along, and are we getting the right kinds of patient results from the new drugs we're developing? And then there's sort of what might be called population health data, health economic data. Are our drugs affordable for the segments that we're targeting them at, and are they having the right result in the broader marketplace? These are all important types of data, and one of the problems in pharma is that they haven't historically been terribly integrated with each other. They've been in separate silos. So I think the best organizations in the future will attempt to combine them more effectively and have a more enterprise-oriented approach to being data-driven.
Gentlemen, I'd like to extend my heartfelt thank you for your time today. I really enjoyed the event, and I'm sure that all of our attendees have as well. I'd like to remind everybody that there has been a white paper authored on this by both Bill and Tom, and it's a fantastic read. You can download the white paper at surveymagazine.org. Just follow the prompts to the Teradata webinar, and you'll see a link there to download the white paper. I'd also like to alert our listeners that Tom has recently published a new book. It's called Big Data at Work. It's also a fantastic read, and I would encourage you to try to acquire that book. It's available at Amazon and at Tom's website. You will be receiving an email from us that will have the on-demand links, and the recording of today's webinar would allow you to download the presentation, listen to the recording, and share with your colleagues. On behalf of our guests, Tom Davenport and Bill Franks, as well as the entire team at Teradata, My name is John Lehman. I'd like to thank you for your time today and have a great afternoon.